I just wanted to kind of summarize a little bit what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what the trend landscape looks like for the SMBs, and especially like small office and home office customers. And then a little bit of a F-Secure view on how can we protect those and what technologies do we use, because there is quite a lot of different ways that you can basically protect the customers from the same threats. And we want to clarify which threats are, or which techniques are corresponding to which threats in the best possible way. For those who haven't heard about F-Secure before, knows who we are. We are a pioneer in cybersecurity. We've been working together with ISPs for about 20 years. We selected ISPs as our main go-to-market channel already 20 years ago, and we are actually one of the companies who were part of creating kind of a software as a service environment. So we work with about 200 different service providers globally. And the two things we pride ourselves for is a high net promoter scores from our partners that we work with. So we work very closely with our partners, ensuring the success of our own products and of our partners, obviously. And then the technology that we provide. So we are the only player in this space who have won AV-TEST Best Protection Award 7 out of past 10 years. We just received one for the 2020 as well. So talking about the protection technology, and especially when we talk about the businesses and the different segments that there are, we try to provide the same or at least shared security technology for all the different companies and different segments. So if we talk about the consumer market, for example, we use the same exact protection technology when it comes to functionalities like browsing protection, parental controls, and so forth, as we use on the SMB segment or with the mid-market or even with the large enterprises who are buying like security suites from us. We're using the exact same protection technology, protection cloud, and artificial intelligence behind that to provide that protection technology. And if you look, for example, at the awards that we have received, those are widely distributed between our products on the SMB side, on the consumer side, on the enterprise side, and so forth. So today we're going to be talking more about the small businesses, and even like to narrow it even more about the SOHO segment, because that's what we see as where the prime opportunity is for the service providers. And those are usually the ones who also require the most help when it comes to protecting themselves, their business, the infrastructure, and so forth. When we look at these different segments, a lot of our operators are doing major investments at this moment. So you're either investing in Wi-Fi 6, or you're expanding your infrastructure, or you're doing things to improve your service delivery, for example. And all of those obviously require a lot of funds, a lot of resources, and so forth. So we see, and this is just not us, also like independent studies show that there needs to be a balancing act, and somewhere, you need to find where to get those invested funds basically back from your customers. And we see value-added services and cybersecurity, especially because that's one of those things that is typically on customers' minds, as kind of a contributor to that payback for your investments. And in many cases, providing value-added services to your customers using that brand new infrastructure or that improved process, that's how you get your funds back. We see that it's a high margin product. It's attractive because it can be easily bundled, can be either bundled together, or it can be sold separately. Together with the broadband connection, it generates higher ARPU. It also leads to a lower churn, and the customers the more services they basically get from you, the less likely they are to churn. And there's also things like protecting your customers. So you don't want your customers to be complaining about security issues which they experienced on your network. So there's kind of a brand angle that some of our customers are looking into, and that's why many of them are providing security services as part of the solution as well, either charging separately or providing it as part of the bundle. When we look at these different segments, a lot of our operators are doing major investments at this moment. So you're either investing in Wi-Fi 6, or you're expanding your infrastructure, or you're doing things to improve your service delivery, for example. And all of those obviously require a lot of funds, a lot of resources, and so forth. So we see, and this is just not us, also like independent studies show that there needs to be a balancing act, and somewhere, you need to find where to get those invested funds basically back from your customers. And we see value-added services and cybersecurity, especially because that's one of those things that is typically on customers' minds, as kind of a contributor to that payback for your investments. And in many cases, providing value-added services to your customers using that brand new infrastructure or that improved process, that's how you get your funds back. We see that it's a high margin product. It's attractive because it can be easily bundled, can be either bundled together or it can be sold separately. Together with the broadband connection, it generates higher ARPU. It also leads to a lower churn, and the customers the more services they basically get from you, the less likely they are to churn. And there's also things like protecting your customers. So you don't want your customers to be complaining about security issues which they experienced on your network. So there's kind of a brand angle that some of our customers are looking into, and that's why many of them are providing security services as part of the solution as well, either charging separately or providing it as part of the bundle. When we look at this segment specifically at the SOHO, and this is a chart from Gartner where we look at 1 to 9 employees. And when we look at this from cybersecurity standpoint, we try to identify like how much the customer has to lose, because just the number of employees doesn't necessarily say what is the risk level that the customer is in. So for example, if you run a small company that is, let's say it's a construction company, for example, the customer data that you have in your systems or the own data that you need to protect is not necessarily that valuable, as opposed to if you say run an attorney office or you have a medical clinic where you have customers' medical information to protect. So in those cases, you might be a small practice, but the amount of data that is in your hands might be way more valuable than just the amount of people you have. So, that's kind of the angle that we want to position or segment these customers into, that, how much they have to protect. But at the same time, we don't look too much into the customer segment, which has a separate IT infrastructure or has an IT support. So typically, if you have like 50 plus, maybe 100 employees, then at that point you start to have IT support and then those kind of supportive functions which help you deploying these security solutions. So today we're going to be talking more about the customers who don't have that at their disposal. They are behaving very much consumer-like. The purchasing process, the way, the kind of services they demand are very similar to what your consumer customers would expect from their service providers. And that's why one of our recommendations is to treat them very like the same, so that you don't necessarily have to reinvent the products that you have today. You might just reposition them in a different way so that it speaks better basically to this customer segment. It is a growing market. Small businesses are spending more on the IT, they're spending more on software. The device spend and IT services spend has actually been rather flat, but we do expect that there will be growth to come at about 7%, but we expect that to increase because they are highly targeted. So when we look at the threat landscape, what these companies are actually up against and what are we trying to protect them against? Just to take a bit of a step back to give you a bigger picture of the threat landscape. So when we look at the different attacks and threats, we try to use this with this kind of a triangle where a lot of like these commodity threats and threats that you typically see in the consumer market are basically mass attacks. So if we talk about phishing, malware, ransomware, those are typically, sent out there and whoever catches them is a good target. The bad guys don't really care like who ends up with the ransomware. They only, are interested that you pay at some point. Then when we go kind of a lever up, and when we start looking into more targeted attacks, more advanced threats, we look at things like, wireless scripts or even direct attacks at customer networks. Then, this is the area where the SMBs typically fall. They're a bit of a kind of between the mass attacks and advanced threats. And the reason is that, SMBs, as I mentioned before, some of them might have a lot to lose. So they might have valuable information, valuable data, customer information, which is way more valuable to the criminals as opposed to targeting just a random individual. That's why there might be more targeted attacks towards SMBs, even if they are a little bit smaller in their size. Then when we move higher up in the hierarchy, we'll look at more organized crimes who are typically targeting enterprise customers. And then the last is nation states, where the tools that they use are way more complex and can basically penetrate almost any protection for that matter. So as I mentioned, the cyber criminals are targeting this segment because it's just lucrative. It's they have limited IT resources. They cannot do as much as enterprises could to protect themselves. They have usually more data than consumers do, and it's a significant risk. So, for example, if you aim to get small business that gets infected by ransomware, the chances are higher that you will actually get a payment from them, because they need to get the business up and running in the same way as the businesses cannot afford to just shut down for a couple of days just to handle the ransomware attack. Many of them prefer to pay just to get business up and running because it will cost them more in the downtime. We actually see that 58% of all cyber attacks in like global scale are targeting small businesses. And this is exactly why that's just so easy and lucrative. Then if we look at the different kind of areas of cyber attacks that we see targeting this segment mostly, obviously there are others, but these are the biggest ones. Ransomware, which I mentioned already, this is something we see across the segments, but SMBs are hit hardest. They have less protection against it, and they are most likely to pay. Things like, phishing links or SMS messages and so forth, that's the kind of the technique that is usually used to get the ransomware on your endpoint device, be it your computer or a mobile phone for that matter. The idea is that you get the malware on the device and then you lock it down and ask for ransom, usually in the form of Bitcoin or something similar that is not traceable basically to the criminal. So they ask for payment and then you get your files or your device back. There are different ways that these are done nowadays. It could just encrypt your files or just delete the files. We've seen now some versions where your files are encrypted, but then if there is content in the files that you don't necessarily want others to see, they're using that as an extortion mechanism. So you don't have access to your data, but they're saying that if you don't pay, we will publish all of this on Facebook, for example. So there are different techniques that are used there. And when thinking about the SMB customers, especially if something like a cash register machine or like an office computer, which people are using to, log their hours, for example, if that gets attacked, it stops the business in many cases. Then the next one is phishing and breaches. And these are typically something that kind of can happen on two sides. It can be done directly attacking you as an individual, sending you a phishing link or some other way to extract information from you to get to your account. So what the bad guys are basically trying to do is take over one of your existing accounts to some of your online services. And if you think about the services that SMBs use, obviously different kind of payment platforms are crucial, especially now that a lot of commerce has moved online. So PayPal and similar services are a good kind of a target. And obviously they're doing as much as they can to protect the services themselves. But if your password leaks online, there's not too much they can do. And then the second part is that if the service that you're actually using gets breached kind of from the other side, and that's kind of where SMBs don't have too much that they can do about it after the fact, except to change the password very fast. But there are things that can be done ahead of time. For example, not using the same password across all the different services that you have. In that way, if one of them gets breached, you change your passwords as fast as you can. And then all the rest of the services are still protected because the same password cannot be used to take over their accounts in other places. Something that we see more and more, and this has been kind of one of the biggest threats for SMBs because they typically have a lot of online services which are publicly facing. And I'm talking about websites, apps, and other services which might like file exchange locations and other things which are available online. And many of those services have vulnerabilities, especially if they're not patched for a while. And a most typical attack is usually against the company's website, because that's the one that everybody can find. Everybody can scan and see, how old your WordPress version is that you're using today, and what other vulnerabilities associated with that version. And that way they can easily get into the web server and change content there, or even install malware or distribute ransomware and things like that. And then the last one is coming from the consumer side, but actually IoT attacks have been more prevalent in the SMB side, way before IoT was even a thing really on the consumer side. So if you think about systems like your printers, your surveillance cameras, your payment terminals, if somebody remembers the Target attack way back in the days, I think this is like 2011 maybe, that was done using the vulnerability in the software that was provided by the payment terminal company. And that's how all the data from Target was stolen. So in the same way, all the small businesses have like some sort of a payment system, that especially those that are facing their customers. So they might have payment terminals, they might have IoT devices in their offices, things like, that you wouldn't think of, like vending machine, for example. A lot of modern vending machines are connected to the internet so that the supplier knows when you run out of snacks, and they know when to refill the machine. And so it's one of the targets for the criminals. Then when we look at the techniques that are being used, so the oldest techniques and probably the most prevalent still is phishing. And when we go into the SMB world, phishing is very effective because it's something that people who receive these messages are actually dealing with every day. Companies like DocuSign, eFax, Zooms, and others are being copied with the messages that they send. So bad guys basically just take the message that DocuSign would typically send to review a document or to sign a contract, and they just copy that and start sending it around with their own embedded links, which point to usually malicious locations. Interesting statistics. This is something that we generated from our labs when we look at the different phishing emails. And here you can see a little bit of a comparison of how much of attacks are actually done against SMBs versus how much are done against consumers. If you look at the brands that are being used in the top 20 listing here, Outlook, Office 365, LinkedIn Corporation, DHL, Microsoft OneDrive, those are all SMB services. Not too many individuals are necessarily using DHL Airways, for example. It's very much an enterprise service or SMB service for small companies. So those are the ones that kind of are being used as the sources where the message is supposed to be coming from. And then when we look at the IoT space, just a couple of weeks back, there was a huge leak, or not a leak, but vulnerability that was found in the protocol that is used to connect a lot of devices online. So basically TCP/IP vulnerability which basically exposes about 100 million devices that are currently connected to the internet to a potential attacks. And these are things that are very hard to fix afterwards. Like once you have a protocol rolled out to hundreds of millions of devices, it's not like you're going to patch all those devices and change them to work in some other way to mitigate this attack. They will stay there for probably another 10 to 20 years. So you need to have other ways to protect these devices from outside attacks when they are in your local home network or office network. The key thing to understand when we talk about threats is that you might have 100 things to protect. You have your customer data, your website, your devices, and so forth. But attacker only needs one vulnerability. They need one entry point basically into your business. And once they have that, it doesn't really matter how well you protected everything else, because they would be on the inside. And we see if there's a vulnerability, for example, it takes an average 3 months to fix it. So let's say you have a WordPress site, which I use here as an example, which hasn't been patched for a couple of days. That is something that an attacker might have known already a couple of months before it became public. And they might have used that already, but you have no idea about the fact that your site has been breached. It only takes a couple of weeks to exploit the vulnerability, but it takes 3 months to patch it. And most companies, it actually takes 280 days to even detect that they have been breached in one way or another, or that there has been an attack. So the bad guys are trying to do everything they can to hide their steps and not to show that they are prevalent in your systems. And then when we look at the impact of all of this, obviously, I mentioned already the monetary loss and if the business is down, but the bigger threats are the data thefts, because that doesn't only impact the SMB or the small office, but it also impacts your customer or their customers. And that might be a huge impact on the brand. Things like identity theft are usually driven by the stolen data, and that stolen data is then used to commit more crimes, basically by impersonating as you and so forth. And then the second part is organizational impact, like how much work is it to fix things like this? And that is usually something that a lot of small businesses don't think about. Like if you ask a CISO of a Fortune 500 company, his biggest concern is if something goes south, how much resources will I need to fix this and who will pay for that? So they try to mitigate and get budgets as much as possible ahead of time, not to end up in that situation. Small businesses typically don't think that way. They are looking into, that's why where they are very consumer-like. They don't want to pay for services in advance. And that's kind of where it's kind of hard to get them to understand. If we look at what F-Secure has to provide in this space and how we see which are kind of the most appealing solutions. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the same services we're providing for our consumer customers, and we're talking about endpoint security, which a lot of companies on this call are providing to their customers already, at least for the consumer market. Router-based security, which protects all the devices basically in your network. That is very similarly applicable for a small SMB customer who might have one office with one router, and we can provide very same services with very same protection technology to those SMBs. But there are also things which can be provided on the network, and this comes more from enterprise side towards the SMB market. We see a lot of service providers globally looking into using DNS-based security as an offering for SMBs. We also do have more robust services which provide more functionality, which more controls, more detection capabilities, protection for your servers, for cloud protection, things like managing your whole infrastructure basically, or going all the way to providing consulting services where we're actually doing things like red teaming, doing like physical entry into the offices and trying to steal information from the companies, for example. So we're doing those to kind of show the weak points of the companies. But when we look at the SMB segment specifically, our recommendation is to stick as close as possible to the consumer offerings, because in our experience, when we start moving into the more complex solutions, that's where you're on that limit where the companies are starting to become 50, 100 employees of size, and they start to have their IT department who is handling all these things for the employees. So these services are a bit of an overkill usually for the SMB and SOHO segment. We are offering our endpoint security in the same way as we're providing that to the consumer space. We are providing that to the SMB sector as well. So similar kind of functionalities can be found on both sides. So you can do things like browsing protection, content filtering, Wi-Fi security through VPN, which has been extremely appealing for the company, especially those that are mostly on the move or don't necessarily have an office space or work mostly from home. And these services can be offered in the same way as you offer your consumer services today to the SMBs. We can just rebrand the product basically to provide a different look and feel, and that would make it more appealing to the SMB segment. And the second one that I wanted to highlight is the IoT protection, which I mentioned earlier. So in the same way as consumers are being protected by the security in their routers, we can protect the SMBs in the very same way with functionalities on the router, basically securing your connection, going in and out of the office network, protecting the devices from each other so that, if you have one infected camera, you don't end up infecting all the other smart devices in the office, and providing the visibility basically for the employees, or at least for the owners, so that they know which devices are connected to the network, what kind of privileges do they have, what kind of limitations, like are they actually protected, and what is happening on the network, so how many threats are being blocked and things like that. When we move kind of a little bit of upscale, I mentioned that we have solutions that are more SMB focused, and we use the same solutions in our enterprise segment as well. So if there are companies that require more management, if they want to automate things, they want to manage things themselves, they have an IT department, then there are more robust solutions where we can do more integration. We can embed the solutions into their infrastructure and provide access to security capabilities for servers, for example, and provide advanced threat detection, response technologies, even all the way to outsourcing your whole cybersecurity to F-Secure. Just to summarize, there is a significant growth in this area. There's a lot of demand, especially now that companies are dispersed, working from home and so forth. And there's a growing need for the security. So the SMB is the most targeted segment. That's kind of the key message, basically, of this presentation. And we see that operators are in the best position to serve that segment because you have the most experience from the consumer market, and this segment acts in a very similar way. So, and obviously, F-Secure is happy to explain in more details how our solutions can help you with protection for that customer segment. And in the end, obviously, we're all trying to make higher ARPU and provide better customer satisfaction to the customers.